Hi, I'm Rick Reynolds, founder and president of Affair Recovery. And today, I'd like to talk about communication. In this week's newsletter, Lies We Believe About Our Mate, I talk about the lens we see our mate through and how we need the ability to begin to shift that lens, but at the same time, there are blind spots that we fail to see within ourselves. And when I think about communication, I think that's one of the primary ways that we develop that distortion in the lens that we see one another through. So I'd like to talk about two different issues that create a problem. The first is how we as couples have a tendency to talk about two different things at the same time while thinking we're talking about the same thing. So there's a great example in the HBO sitcom Lucky Louie. And it's a conversation between Louie and his wife Kim, and they're going to have this romantic weekend, and so he brings her flowers and presents them to her with a flourish, expecting a great response from her. So let me read the dialogue. Louie, I'd like to give you some advice. Listen, try not to take this the wrong way, okay? But if we're going to be married for the next 30 years, I need you to know that red roses just are not my thing. I really don't like red roses. Louis, okay. Can I critique how you just told me that? It's not a big deal. I just think that you should have thanked me for the flowers first and then said the thing about the roses. Kim, I've told you before that I don't like red roses. Remember that? Louis, but still, I was thinking of you, so I bought you flowers. Kim, if you were thinking of me, you wouldn't have gotten me red roses. Louis, oh, come on, Kim. I bought you flowers. That's a nice thing. You say, thank you. It's called being polite. Kim, you know what would be polite? If I told you things and you actually listened. Louis, hang on. All I'm asking for is a tiny bit of gratitude, so maybe they're not your favorite kind of flowers. Kim, no, I didn't say they're not my favorite kind of flower. I said I don't like red roses. Louis, what's wrong with you? Are you allergic to saying thank you to people? Kim, how do you expect someone to say thank you for giving them something you specifically told them you didn't want? Louis, you know what's a better question? How you can get given red roses and turn around and act like this, which is not an uncommon couples conversation. Roses may be the topic that the two of them are talking about, but they're both talking about very different things. You see, Kim's saying, when I tell you things and you don't listen to me, it's a huge insult. And it makes me feel like I don't matter. Now, those aren't the specific words she's saying, but underneath the message of all of this is she's hurt because she said that she, doesn't like red roses and he brings red roses, so she doesn't feel listened to. Louis, on the other hand, makes a huge mistake, goes right by the fact that she feels unheard and unseen, and he changes the topic and he begins to talk about feeling unappreciated. And so often, I see couples miss this fact. It is a classic example of a right fight. Neither is wrong in what they're saying. He does want to feel appreciated. That's important to him. And she does want to be heard. She wants him to listen so she doesn't feel unimportant to him. And they can have this topic all day long and both end up seeing the other person through a very distorted lens, which to me is really sad. One of the things I wish I could get couples to do, and they do it in my office, but only by me sitting there kind of saying, whoa, let's slow down. What's underneath here? It's trying to just consider what's the real topic under the issue that you're talking about. You may be talking about roses, but why is that an important thing to you? And then why are you wanting to respond that way? I mean, to me, with right fights, what's important is our ability to separate intent versus the impact of our actions. And so often I think that, and Steph and I do this all the time, I may do something that offends her or hurts her, And then I'm going, holy smoke. I mean, that's how she's impacted, right? And I'm going, but that wasn't my intent. My intent was this. And I'll talk about my intent and she'll talk about how she's hurt, and we can't ever resolve that. So I'm just going to encourage you, consider maybe having two separate conversations. If you can begin to identify and only talk about one issue at a time, I think it'd be really helpful. Another thing I just want to bring up today is it's the barrier of what we face often after a fight. So let's say I get angry at Stephanie for taking too long to respond to a text that I've sent her. And I let her know how I feel about it. And I'm really upset because my feelings are hurt because she didn't respond. I can tell you the next day making up is going to be a challenge, and here's why. Because Stephanie's probably going to bring up how I mistreated her, about my anger, my outburst, and I'll be defensive saying something like, I didn't raise my voice, because in my mind, I really didn't. I don't even remember being angry about it. All I remember is going to be the provocation, the threat. I just remember the hurt that happened when she didn't respond to my text. So I don't remember being angry, honestly. I didn't raise my voice, right? I just remember you didn't respond to that text, right? But for Stephanie, my anger is the threat. It's just not part of the story. My anger ends up being the story, which ends up being a huge problem. And I see this all the time as we deal with infidelity. You know, one person will be really hurt and they'll be talking about how angry they are. And the next day, maybe the other person's going, you know, I can't believe how much you yelled at me and all you did. And the other person may very likely go, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get violent. I didn't go crazy. Because all they're remembering is the hurt they were expressing. They don't remember their behavior because that's not the issue. The issue was the fact they were feeling hurt or triggered by what the other person said. But the other person, all they can see is the anger because that was the threat. It had nothing to do with the hurt or the pain. And it does make it complicated for us as we kind of move through these things. And at times I think both of us, you know, both me and Steph, both you and your mate, you have to really step back and recognize that if our mate is saying things to us that we strongly disagree with, that perhaps we actually have a blind side, a blind spot that we're not seeing, that I need to consider the possibility that maybe I'm not aware of how I come across in things. In the book, Thanks for the Feedback, it talks about a thing called the STS, the Superior Temporal Sulcus, STS, which is located above the ear. And at 4 months, all auditory information, whether your mother's voice or a car horn, is attended by the STS. But by 7 months, babies start signaling out human voices as only sounds that trigger attention from the STS. And the STS shows especially heightened activity when that voice carries emotion. This little piece of our brain is dedicated to taking in language and reading tone and meaning. What's interesting about the STS, so when we're talking to each other, if there is emotion, that's the piece of our brain that actually hears things. However, when we're speaking, the STS turns off and we can't even hear how we sound. So our mate may come to us and say, that was a tone of voice. And we go, I don't have a tone of voice. What are you talking about? Well, have you ever noticed that if you listen to a recording of yourself, how weird your voice sounds? That's because you don't listen to your voice in the same way because the STS isn't active. So consider the possibility if your mate says you're using a tone of voice, you actually may be. That may be the blind spot because in reality, we don't always hear us. And that's part of how we begin to slowly shift the lens of how we see each other, simply because we've got to consider that maybe the way we see it isn't right. You know, I just mentioned the book, Thanks for the Feedback. A Fair Recovery, we've been using that particular book, and it's by Douglas Stone and Sheila Heen, as a book study, just to help our communication. And we found it not only useful for our staff, but it's been helpful in the marriages. And I think that you may find the same thing. So here's a simple suggestion. For years, when Steph and I are in the car driving places, we actually just put a book in the car and we read out loud to each other. And we don't read just marriage books or books about infidelity. We read business books, we read novels, we read all kinds of things. But what that little activity, that ritual of being able to read to each other in the car has done for us is it provides an intellectual kind of intimacy. It allows us to have a different type of conversation instead of just the same conversation we always have about the kids. And I would encourage you to give that a shot. Get the book, Thanks for the Feedback. And as you're driving places to eat with each other in the car, read it out loud to one another and talk about what it talks about, or come up with some way of using that book. But I think, as good as any book I've ever seen, because I've read a lot of marriage books, believe it or not, it gives you some very simple understanding about how we talk to each other and maybe how to be understood. To healing.